They say you can't run from your ghosts, but Elias tried. He moved to the deepest part of the Blackwood forest, a place where the moss is so thick it swallows sound before it can even be born. He didn't want to hear the world anymore. To Elias, a falling leaf sounded like a gunshot, a whisper felt like a scream. He built a fortress of silence to protect his broken mind. But then, on a Tuesday that smelled of ozone and incoming storms, the forest decided to speak back. It didn't use wind, and it didn't use thunder. It sent a messenger. A creature of oil-slick feathers and intelligent, obsidian eyes. A creature that didn't just make bird sounds. It made the one sound Elias thought he had buried 6 years ago along with his career and his wife. It made the sound of a camera shutter. Click. Whir. Click. And just like that, the silence was shattered. The rain in the Pacific Northwest doesn't fall, it occupies. It takes over the air, filling the space between the giant redwoods with a relentless, heavy mist that soaks into the bones of the earth. For most people, the constant drumming of water on a tin roof is a lullaby. For Elias Thorne, it was an assault. Elias lived in a converted fire lookout tower, grounded and reinforced, miles away from the nearest paved road. The interior was a testament to his trauma. Cork lined the walls. Heavy velvet curtains, 3 layers thick, covered every window. The floors were carpeted in dense wool to muffle the sound of footsteps. Elias moved through his home like a ghost, wearing thick, industrial-grade noise-canceling headphones that he only took off when he slept, and sometimes not even then. He was 68 years old, but his eyes carried the exhaustion of a man who had lived 100 lifetimes. His hands, once steady enough to splice millimeter-thin audio tape, now trembled when he poured his tea. Elias had been Hollywood's greatest Foley artist. He was the man who created the sound of a dinosaur's footstep using a watermelon and a sledgehammer. He was the genius who made the sound of a ghost's breath using silk and dry ice. He had spent 40 years listening closer than anyone else. And then came the explosion on the set of The Iron Soldier. A pyrotechnic error. A blast wave that didn't kill him but destroyed the delicate filters in his brain that processed sound. The doctors called it severe hyperacusis combined with auditory processing disorder. The world didn't just get louder, it got violent. The scraping of a fork on a plate caused him physical pain, like a needle driven into his temple. The laughter of a child sounded like distorted static. So, he ran. He took his savings, bought the silence of the woods, and took the only creature on earth he could tolerate, Barnaby. Barnaby was a Great Dane, a massive, lumbering beast with a coat like gray flannel. Barnaby was perfect because Barnaby was stone deaf. The dog never barked, never whined. He communicated in heavy sighs and the rhythmic thumping of his tail against the floor cushions, a low-frequency vibration Elias could feel rather than hear. They were a pair of broken instruments, living in a world that had no use for them. It was November when the silence broke. Not with a noise, but with a presence. Elias was sitting in his armchair, reading a book on mycology, the only science that required no noise. Barnaby was asleep at his feet, dreaming of chasing rabbits he couldn't hear. Outside, the wind had picked up, a gale force pushing against the trees. Elias could see the vibrations in the window glass, even if he couldn't hear the howling. He tightened his headphones, adjusting the dial to pump in white noise, frequency a soft, static hum that masked the world. Then he saw it. A dark shape slammed against the window. It wasn't a branch. It was alive. Elias flinched, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited for the creature to fly away, but it didn't. It slid down the glass, leaving a smear of dark fluid. Blood. He stood up, his joints popping, a sound that made him wince even through the headphones. He approached the glass and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain just an inch. On the ledge of the lookout tower, huddled against the storm, was a raven. But this was no ordinary scavenger. It was massive, its feathers iridescent in the dim light, shifting from black to purple to green. One of its wings hung at an awkward angle, dragging against the wet wood. It was grounded. Elias stared at it. The logical part of his brain told him to close the curtain. Nature was cruel. Things died in the forest every day. That was the cycle. If he opened that window, he let the noise in. The wind, the rain, the screeching of a wounded animal. It would be agony. But then the raven turned its head. It looked directly through the glass, through the layers of protection, and met Elias's gaze. Its eyes were not the blank, instinctual eyes of a bird. They were sharp, calculating, and terrifyingly human. It opened its beak. Elias saw the throat move. He saw the beak snap shut. But he heard nothing through his headphones. The bird tapped on the glass. 1, 2, 3, tap, tap, tap. Elias stepped back. The rhythm was precise. It wasn't the frantic flailing of a dying animal. It was a knock. Barnaby lifted his massive head, sniffing the air, sensing the disturbance in the room's energy. Elias hesitated. He looked at the storm raging outside, then at the crippled bird. He remembered the feeling of being broken, of being overwhelmed by a world that was too much to handle. With a groan of frustration, he grabbed a thick towel from the kitchen and moved to the side door. He braced himself. He took a deep breath, squeezed his eyes shut, and unlocked the heavy deadbolt. The moment he cracked the door, the sound hit him like a physical blow. The wind roared, a chaotic symphony of violence. Elias gasped, pain shooting behind his eyes. He almost slammed the door shut, but he forced himself to reach out. He threw the towel over the black bundle of feathers on the ledge and scooped it up. He slammed the door, locked it, and slid down to the floor, clutching the bundle to his chest, waiting for the ringing in his ears to subside. Silence returned. Or, at least, the muffled safety of the cabin returned. Slowly, Elias unwrapped the towel. The raven was calm. Surprisingly calm. It didn't peck or scratch. It simply shook its feathers, sending a spray of rainwater onto the carpet. It looked at Barnaby, who was watching with mild interest, and then it looked at Elias. "Don't make a sound," Elias whispered, his own voice sounding foreign and distorted in his ears. "Please, just don't make a sound." He examined the wing. It wasn't broken, just badly bruised, perhaps sprained from the impact. There was a gash on its leg, deep and angry. Elias, who had spent years splicing tape and repairing delicate microphones, had steady hands when he wasn't in pain. He fetched his first aid kit. For the next hour, the cabin was a tableau of strange surgery. The old man, the deaf dog, and the wild bird. Elias cleaned the wound with saline. The bird flinched but didn't cry out. It watched Elias's hands with an intensity that was unnerving. It seemed to be studying him. When he was finished, Elias set up a cardboard box in the corner, lined with old T-shirts. "Stay there," he mouthed. "Heal. Then go." But the raven had other plans. It hopped out of the box immediately. It moved with a lopsided gait, dragging the bad wing, exploring the cabin. It pecked at the cork on the walls. It inspected the legs of the table. It seemed fascinated by the silence. Days turned into a week. The storm passed, but the bird stayed. Elias named it Poe, unoriginal, he knew, but he didn't have the energy for creativity. Poe was a ghost in the house. He made no bird sounds. No caws, no croaks. He moved silently, hopping from furniture to furniture. Barnaby accepted the bird with the grace of the senile, allowing Poe to perch on his sleeping flank. It was a peaceful, bizarre coexistence. Until the 7th morning. Elias was in the kitchen, making toast. The toaster popped, a sudden mechanical clack. Elias winced, rubbing his temples. From the living room, he heard it. Clack. Elias froze. He turned around. The toaster was in front of him, but the sound had come from behind him. He walked slowly into the living room. Poe was perched on the back of the armchair, head cocked to the side. "Did you do that?" Elias whispered. Poe stared. Then the bird opened its beak. Clack. It wasn't an imitation. It was a recording. It was the exact metallic sound of the toaster spring releasing. It was perfect. It had the same resonance, the same decay. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. "You're a mimic," he said softly. "A clever little mimic." He knew corvids could talk. He had seen videos of them saying, "hello," or "nevermore." But this was different. This wasn't speech. This was Foley. This was sound design. The bird had captured the acoustic signature of the toaster and played it back. Elias sat down slowly. "What else do you have?" he asked, feeling a strange flicker of curiosity, an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Poe hopped down to the floor. He looked at the heavy wool carpet. He hopped twice. Thump, thump. The sound of a footstep. Then, the bird looked up at Elias and did something that stopped the old man's heart. The bird opened its beak and emitted a sound. Scree-pop. Elias grabbed the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. It was the sound of a champagne cork leaving a bottle. But not just any bottle. It was the specific sound effect Elias had created for his masterpiece, the film Midnight in Paris, back in 1998. He had spent 3 days getting that pop right. He had used a vintage bottle and a specific microphone placement. How? Elias breathed, his voice trembling. How do you know that? The bird couldn't know it. It was impossible. A wild bird in the Olympic rainforest couldn't know a sound effect from a movie made 20 years ago. Unless the bird had heard it here. Elias realized he must have made the sound himself. Maybe he had opened a bottle of wine. No, he didn't drink alcohol anymore. Maybe a jar. Poe hopped closer. He tilted his head, his black eye reflecting the fear in Elias's face. Then, the bird made another sound. It was a static hiss. The sound of rain. But underneath the rain, there was a melody. A hum. A low, vibrating hum of a woman's voice. Hum hum hum. Hum hum hum. Elias stopped breathing. The air left the room. The silence he had built, the fortress of cork and velvet, suddenly felt like a tomb. That was Margaret's hum. His late wife. She used to hum that specific tune, an old jazz standard, "I'll Be Seeing You," while she brushed her hair in the morning. She had been dead for 6 years. Elias hadn't listened to recordings of her. It was too painful. He hadn't hummed that tune. He hadn't thought of that tune because thinking of it brought the sound of her laughter, and the sound of her laughter brought the memory of the explosion that took her voice away from him before it took his hearing. "Stop," Elias whispered, tears instantly springing to his eyes. "Stop it." Poe didn't stop. The bird amplified the sound. It was coming from the bird's throat, but it sounded like it was coming from a high-fidelity speaker. Hum hum hum. I said stop. Elias screamed, the sound of his own voice ripping through his sensitive ears like a saw. He lunged at the bird. Poe flapped his good wing and hopped backward, agile and quick. He flew up to the high curtain rod, looking down at Elias with those intelligent, unblinking eyes. Elias fell to his knees, covering his ears, sobbing. "Where did you hear that? Who sent you?" The bird watched him. It waited until Elias's sobs quieted into jagged breaths. Then, softly, gently, Poe made a new sound. It was the sound of a page turning in a book. Swish. Then the sound of a tea kettle whistling, but soft, distant. Then the sound of Barnaby's tail thumping. Thump thump. The bird was building a soundscape. It was taking the sounds of Elias's isolated, lonely life and reflecting them back to him. But amongst those sounds, it kept weaving that hum. Margaret's hum. Elias stared up at the curtain rod. He realized then that he wasn't dealing with a normal animal. He didn't believe in ghosts. He was a man of science, of acoustics, of physics. But he couldn't explain this. "You're mocking me," Elias said, his voice hollow. Poe leaned forward. He made a clicking sound. Click-whir. The sound of the film projector. The sound of Elias's old life. And then, for the first time, the bird spoke a word. It wasn't a mimicry of a human voice. It sounded like it was cut and pasted from different audio sources. A syllable of static, a syllable of wind, a syllable of a crunching branch. Li-yi. Sten. Elias froze. "Listen," the bird repeated, the sound clearer this time. Elias slowly took his hands away from his headphones. He reached up and, for the first time in 3 years while awake, he pulled the heavy cups away from his ears. The silence of the room rushed in, heavy and thick. But it wasn't empty. He could hear the rain outside, muffled by the walls. He could hear Barnaby's breathing. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator. It hurt. It all hurt. His brain spiked with pain. But up on the curtain rod, Poe began to sing. It wasn't a bird song. It was a construction. Poe began to layer sounds. He made the sound of wind chimes. He layered the sound of a stream. He layered the sound of a cello, God knows where he had heard a cello. It was a composition. And as Elias listened, squeezing his eyes shut against the sensitivity, he realized the bird was matching the pitch of the ringing in Elias's ears. The bird had found the frequency of Elias's tinnitus, the constant high-pitched squeal that never left him, and was harmonizing with it. The bird was tuning the world to Elias. For the first time since the accident, the pain didn't vanish, but it changed. It became part of a chord. The sharp needle in his brain dulled into a throb, and then into a rhythm. Elias sat on the floor, looking up at the black bird with the broken wing. "Who are you?" Elias asked into the semi-silence. Poe didn't answer with words. He dropped a single black feather. It drifted down, spiraling through the air, and landed on Elias's knee. Then, the bird mimicked the sound of a zipper being pulled up. Zip. It was the sound Elias made every night when he zipped up his sleeping bag. The bird had been listening. The bird had been recording. The bird had been waiting for the moment when the audio engineer was ready to mix the track. Elias picked up the feather. It was warm. "Okay," Elias whispered. "I'm listening." If silence was a shield, then sound was a weapon. Elias had spent 3 years believing this. But in the weeks following the raven's arrival, he began to learn a third option. Sound could be a map. Poe wasn't just making noise. He was drawing a blueprint of the world outside, filtering it, softening the edges, and feeding it to Elias in manageable, bite-sized frequencies. The cabin had transformed from a tomb into a studio, and the bird was the lead engineer. The mornings were the hardest. Waking up meant transitioning from the safety of dreams into the sensory minefield of reality. Usually, Elias would wake with his heart racing, anticipating the phantom crash of the explosion that had ruined his hearing. But now, the mornings began with a rhythm. Scritch, scritch, tap. Elias opened his eyes. Poe was standing on the footboard of the bed, dragging his claw against the wood in a slow, deliberate tempo. It was soft, barely 10 decibels. A sound Elias could tolerate without the headphones. "Good morning, maestro," Elias whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. Poe bobbed his head. He didn't caw. Instead, he opened his beak and produced the sound of water boiling. Bub 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 hiss. It was the audio cue for coffee. Elias sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. Barnaby, the deaf Great Dane, felt the vibration of Elias's movement and thumped his tail, a bass drum beat to accompany Poe's treble. This had become their routine. The calibration. Elias realized early on that Poe wasn't just mimicking sounds randomly. He was desensitizing Elias. It was a technique known in audiology as tinnitus retraining therapy, but performed by a wild bird with a broken wing. Poe would introduce a sound, like the creak of a floorboard, at a very low volume. If Elias flinched, Poe would stop. He would wait. Then he would try again, softer, until Elias nodded. Only then would Poe increase the volume. They were retuning Elias's brain, one frequency at a time. By the third week, Elias felt brave enough to open the closet he hadn't touched in 3 years. The graveyard of gear. He turned the handle, holding his breath against the squeak of the hinge. Inside, stacked in dust-proof cases, was the equipment of a lifetime. Sennheiser microphones, Rycote windshields, and the crown jewel, his Nagra 4S analog tape recorder. Poe hopped onto Elias's shoulder, his talons gripping the thick flannel shirt. He peered into the closet and let out a low whistle, a perfect imitation of a falling bomb from an old cartoon. "Funny," Elias muttered, a small smile cracking his dry lips. "Very funny." He pulled out the Nagra. It was heavy, built like a tank. He set it on the dining table. The tactile sensation of the switches, the smell of the magnetic tape, the cold aluminum, it grounded him. He wasn't just a victim of sound anymore. He was a master of it. "Okay," Elias said, plugging in a set of high-impedance headphones that he could control separately from his protective ones. "Let's see what you really are." He hit record. The reels began to spin. "Give me something," Elias commanded softly. Poe stood on the table, right in front of the microphone. He looked at the spinning reels with intense curiosity. Then, he began his performance. He didn't mimic a toaster or a zipper this time. He mimicked a conversation. It was garbled, like a radio tuned between stations. Static, murmurs, and then distinct words cut through the noise. Forecast calls for heavy rain. Be careful on the ridge. Elias froze. That was the voice of the local park ranger, Ranger Miller. Elias hadn't seen Miller in 6 months, not since the ranger dropped off supplies at the gate. Poe shifted his stance and changed the channel. He's a recluse. Sad story. Wife died. This voice was different. A woman's voice. Young. Maybe a hiker. Elias stared at the bird. You've been listening to them, he whispered. You're out there, recording them. Poe tilted his head and made the sound of a camera shutter. Click. Elias stopped the tape. His hands were shaking. This bird was a living surveillance device. A feathered black box. But why bring these sounds to him? Was it to show him the world was still turning? Or was it a warning? The ghost in the machine, the mystery of the Margaret hum, still haunted Elias. He needed to know where Poe had heard it. Elias spent the afternoons digging through his personal archives. Boxes of DAT tapes, reel-to-reels, hard drives. He searched for a recording of Margaret humming, "I'll Be Seeing You." He found videos of their wedding, audio of her laughing at a dinner party, tracks of her reading poetry. But no humming. I never recorded it, Elias realized, sitting amidst a sea of magnetic tape. I was always so busy recording the important things, the dialogue, the effects, that I missed the background noise of my own life. He looked at Poe, who was perched on the windowsill, watching the rain. Where did you find it? Elias asked the bird. Poe turned. He didn't make a sound. He simply looked at the door. He hopped down, walked to the door, and looked back at Elias. Then he tapped the wood. Tap, tap, tap. You want to go out? Elias asked. Poe tapped again. Then he made the sound of wind howling. Whoosh. Elias shook his head. No, I can't. The wind, it's too much. The pressure changes. It hurts. Poe didn't relent. He mimicked the sound of a zipper again. Zizzip. He was telling Elias to put on his coat. Elias looked at Barnaby. The dog was already standing by the door, tail wagging slowly. It was a conspiracy. Fine, Elias grumbled. He reached for his heavy-duty protective earmuffs, the industrial ones he wore when he had to use the generator. He zipped up his parka. He felt like an astronaut preparing for a spacewalk. He opened the door. The cold air hit him first, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. Even with the earmuffs, the sound of the forest was a dull roar. The wind in the canopy sounded like a distant freight train. Elias flinched, his shoulders hiking up to his ears. Poe didn't fly. His wing was healing, but he preferred to hop. He led the way, a black ink blot against the green moss. They didn't go far. Just 100 yards from the cabin, down a narrow deer trail Elias used to walk with Margaret years ago. They reached a small clearing where an old, rotted stump sat covered in lichen. Poe hopped onto the stump. He looked at Elias, waiting. Elias approached slowly. The noise of the forest was rising, a crescendo of rustling leaves and snapping twigs. Panic began to bubble in his chest. It's too loud. It's too chaotic. But then, Poe began to vocalize. He didn't mimic a sound this time. He emitted a steady, low-frequency thrum. It was a drone tone, deep and resonant. Elias felt it in his chest more than he heard it. The tone seemed to cut through the chaotic noise of the wind. It acted as an anchor. Elias focused on that single, steady note. As long as he held onto that sound, the rest of the noise became background texture. Poe hopped down from the stump and pecked at the ground at the base of a large Douglas fir tree. Elias knelt, his knees sinking into the wet mud. What is it? There, half buried in the pine needles, was something shiny. Elias brushed away the dirt. It was a small, silver wind chime. His breath caught in his throat. He remembered this. Margaret had hung this chime on this tree 5 years ago. She had said, "So the trees have music when we aren't here." Over the years, the string had broken and the chime had fallen. Elias picked it up. It was corroded, but intact. He held it up to the wind. The silver tubes clinked together. Ting, tang, ting. It was a sharp, high-pitched sound. Normally, this would have sent Elias to his knees in pain. But today, filtered through the memory, filtered through Poe's presence, it just sounded sad and beautiful. And then Poe did it. He opened his beak and harmonized with the wind chime. He produced a perfect crystalline note that matched the silver tube. Ting, bird, tang, chime. And under that, he layered the hum. Hum hum hum. Elias understood then. Poe hadn't heard Margaret. Poe had heard the echo of this place. He had found the objects that held the acoustic memory of her. This bird wasn't just a mimic. He was a resonance chamber. He could sense the emotional residue left on objects, the vibrations that had settled into the wood and the earth. Elias stood up, clutching the dirty wind chime to his chest, tears streaming down his face into his beard. He wasn't crying from pain. He was crying because, for the first time in years, he heard something that wasn't broken. The storm and the studio. They returned to the cabin as the sky turned a bruised purple. A real storm was coming. Not the usual rain, but a Pacific blower, high winds, falling branches, thunder. In the past, a storm like this would mean Elias retreating to the basement, curled in a fetal position, overdosing on sleeping pills to knock himself out before the thunder could split his skull. But today, he had a project. He burst into the cabin, energized. Barnaby, move the rug. Poe, get to your perch. Elias grabbed his recording gear. He set up 2 shotgun microphones pointing at the windows. He set up a contact microphone, a device that records vibrations through solid objects, and attached it to the main support beam of the cabin. We're not hiding this time, Elias said, his eyes feverishly bright. We're going to record it. If we can capture it, we can control it. That's the rule of Foley. If you can make the sound can't hurt you. The wind hit the cabin with a howl that shook the floorboards. Elias put on his mixing headphones. He adjusted the gain on the Nagra. Too loud, he muttered. Compress the low end. He tweaked a dial. The roar of the wind in his headphones smoothed out, becoming a deep, cinematic texture. Poe watched him from the top of the bookshelf. The bird seemed to understand exactly what was happening. Crack. Thunder rolled in the distance. Elias flinched, his hand flying to the volume knob. Poe immediately let out a sound. Rumble. He mimicked the thunder, but he did it softly. Elias looked at the bird. You're anticipating the delay? Light travels faster than sound. Poe saw the flash of lightning through the window, and before the real thunder arrived, he gave Elias a preview sound. A warning. Smart boy, Elias breathed. The real thunder arrived 5 seconds later. Boom. But Elias was ready. He had lowered the levels. He rode the fader, turning the terrifying explosion into a manageable signal on the meter. For the next 3 hours, the man and the bird played the storm like an instrument. When the hail started hitting the tin roof, a sound like 1,000 machine guns, Poe flew to the table and started tapping his beak on a wooden coaster. Tap, tap, tap. He created a counter-rhythm. He turned the chaotic noise of the hail into a jazz percussion beat. Elias recorded it all. He mixed the wind, the thunder, the hail, and Poe's percussive tapping. He added a layer of EQ, equalization, to cut out the painful high frequencies. By midnight, the storm had passed. Elias sat back in his chair, exhausted but exhilaratingly alive. He hit the rewind button. The tape spun back with a high-pitched whine. He hit play. Through the speakers came a soundscape that was otherworldly. It was the storm, but tamed. It was violent, but musical. And weaving through the thunder and the wind was the sound of the bird, clicking, tapping, humming. It was a symphony. The symphony of the storm. Elias looked at Barnaby, who was snoring on the rug. He looked at Poe, who was tucking his head under his wing to sleep. We made something, Elias whispered into the quiet room. We made something new. The intruder. The peace of the sanctuary lasted for 2 more weeks. Elias began to believe this could be his life forever. The hermit, the dog, and the bird. But the world outside was relentless. It started with a low rumble that Poe couldn't filter out because it wasn't natural. It was mechanical. Relentless. Diesel engines. Elias was in the middle of recording Poe mimicking the sound of a melting icicle, a delicate drip-plip sound, when the vibration shook the coffee in his mug. Poe stopped. His feathers puffed up. He let out a sound Elias had never heard before. It was a siren. But it was distorted, angry. Elias went to the window. He didn't need the binoculars. He could see the yellow machines through the trees, about a mile down the valley. Logging trucks and excavators. They were clearing the fire break. It was necessary work to prevent forest fires. Elias knew that. But for him, it was an apocalypse. The sound of chainsaws, falling timber, and reversing trucks would be continuous. It would be a wall of noise that no amount of white noise could mask. Elias felt the familiar panic rising, the cold grip on his throat. He couldn't stay here. Not with that noise. But he couldn't leave. Where would he go? A city. That was suicide. He looked at Poe. The bird was pacing on the table, agitated. "We have to stop them," Elias said, his voice trembling. "Or we have to leave." Poe stopped pacing. He looked at the Nagra recorder. Then he looked at the large PA speakers Elias had mounted in the corners of the room, relics from his old studio days, powerful enough to blast sound across a concert hall. The bird hopped onto the volume dial of the amplifier. He looked at Elias with a glint in his obsidian eye. He pecked the dial. "Turn it up." Elias stared at the bird. A crazy idea began to form in his mind. Foley wasn't just about recording reality. It was about tricking the brain. It was about creating an illusion so convincing that the audience believed what they heard over what they saw. If the loggers heard something that made them leave, something that made them think the forest was haunted or dangerous or protected, Elias looked at his library of tapes. Dinosaur roars. Ghost whispers. The sound of a building collapsing. And now, the recordings of Poe, the bird who could mimic the voice of the forest itself. "You want to fight back?" Elias asked. Poe spread his wings. The injured one was almost fully healed now, and let out a screech that sounded exactly like a braking freight train. Elias smiled. It was a grim, determined smile. He reached for the master fader. "All right, Poe," Elias said, sliding the headphones over his ears. "Let's create a monster. Fear has a frequency." Elias knew this. In horror movies, they use infrasound, a low rumble around 19 hertz. It's below the range of human hearing, but the body feels it. It causes anxiety, nausea, and the unshakable feeling that something is standing right behind you. Elias didn't just want to scare the loggers. He wanted to haunt them. He wanted to make the forest sound like it was waking up, and like it was angry. The cabin looked less like a home and more like a mad scientist's laboratory. Cables snaked across the floor, connecting the Nagra recorder to a series of portable battery-powered amplifiers. Elias moved with a manic energy, his hands flying across the mixing board. "We need more bass," Elias muttered, his eyes glued to the VU meters bouncing in the red. "It needs to rattle their teeth." Poe was perched on top of the equalizer. He was the primary instrument. "Give me the redwood snap," Elias commanded. Poe puffed out his chest and opened his beak. Crack-bum. It was the sound of a massive tree trunk snapping under its own weight, followed by the thunderous impact of it hitting the forest floor. Poe had recorded it 3 days ago during the storm. "Good," Elias said, spinning the reel back. "Now, slow it down. Stretch it." He manipulated the tape speed. The sharp crack transformed into a long, groaning moan. It sounded like the earth itself was tearing open. "Now," Elias looked at the bird. "I need the predator." Poe tilted his head. He switched tracks. Hisses. It was the sound of a mountain lion. But Poe didn't just play it. He remixed it. He layered the mountain lion's hiss with the sound of a steam valve releasing pressure. The result was mechanical yet biological. A cyborg growl. Elias layered the sounds. Track 1, the groaning earth, slowed redwood. Track 2, the steam cat, Poe's remix. Track 3, the infrasound, a synthesized 19 hertz hum. But it was missing something. It needed a soul. It needed a sound that wasn't just scary, but wrong. Elias looked at his own reflection in the dark window. He hesitated. Then, he reached into his drawer and pulled out a tape he had sworn never to play again. The label read, "Set Accident, Audio log, day 42. It was the raw audio from the explosion that had ended his career. He threaded the tape. His hands shook violently. "Are you sure?" he whispered to himself. Poe hopped onto his wrist. The bird's talons were sharp, grounding him. Poe looked at the tape, then at Elias, and gave a soft, encouraging click. Elias spliced a 3-second segment of the explosion, not the bang, but the intake of air right before the blast. The sound of the atmosphere being sucked into a vacuum. He added it to the mix. The result was terrifying. It sounded like a massive, invisible beast taking a deep breath before screaming. "The Phantom," Elias named it. "Let's go introduce them." The acoustic trap. They couldn't play it from the cabin. The physics were wrong. To make the sound believable, they needed the amphitheater. The amphitheater was a geological formation about half a mile away, a concave cliff face that acted like a natural parabolic dish. If you shouted there, the echo would hit the valley floor with triple the intensity. The hike was brutal. Elias, weighed down by the amplifiers and the heavy battery packs, struggled through the undergrowth. Barnaby plodded beside him, carrying a saddlebag with the cables. Poe flew ahead, acting as a scout, returning every few minutes to mimic the sound of the approaching diesel engines. RRRR rumble. Getting louder. They reached the cliff edge. Below them, in the valley, the yellow machines looked like toys. The loggers were clearing a patch of ancient cedar. The sound of chainsaws was a distant, angry buzz that made Elias's teeth ache, even through his heavy earmuffs. "Set up here," Elias signaled. He positioned the speakers pointing directly at the cliff face, not at the loggers. He was going to bounce the sound. This would diffuse the source, making it impossible to pinpoint. It would sound like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere. He wired the system. His heart was hammering against his ribs. This was crazy. He was an old, disabled man fighting a logging company with a tape recorder and a bird. "Ready, maestro?" Elias asked. Poe landed on the play button. The drop. Elias turned the master volume to maximum. The speakers hummed with power. "Hit it." Poe pecked the button. At first, there was nothing. Just the 19 Hz infrasound. Down in the valley, the effect was subtle but immediate. The workers stopped moving. One man took off his hard hat, rubbing his ears. Another looked around, confused. The birds in the valley suddenly took flight, a massive cloud of black wings rising in silence. Then, the breath started. Hua! The vacuum sound. It echoed off the cliff, sounding like the sky itself was inhaling. The chainsaws stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with dread. Then, the groan. GRRRO, AAANNN. The slowed-down tree snap rolled down the valley like an avalanche of sound. It vibrated in the chests of the men below. It sounded like the mountain was waking up. And finally, the scream. Poe's steamcat mixed with the feedback loop. Siri hisses thud. It was unholy. It was the sound of metal tearing and an animal dying, magnified 10 times by the natural acoustics. Elias watched through his binoculars. The reaction was primal. These were tough men, used to dangerous machinery. But this wasn't a danger they could see. One of the excavator drivers panicked. He swung the arm of his machine around wildly, as if trying to hit an invisible attacker. The other workers were backing away, looking at the tree lean. They couldn't see anything. That was the worst part. The sound was surrounding them. Elias pushed the fader. He looped the sound, adding a chaotic delay. Sorry, scree. Now you, Poe. Elias yelled over the noise. Give me the finale. Poe flew up. He soared out over the edge of the cliff, diving into the open air of the valley. As he dived, he opened his beak and mimicked the one sound that triggers instinctual terror in every human being. He mimicked the sound of a crying baby, but he distorted it, dropping the pitch until it sounded like a giant. Wah, wah. Down in the valley, that was the breaking point. The juxtaposition of the monster growl and the distorted cry was too much for the human lizard brain to handle. The foreman waved his arms. Shut it down. The men scrambled into their trucks. The heavy machinery was left idling. Doors slammed. Engines roared. Within 3 minutes, The convoy of yellow trucks was retreating down the access road, kicking up dust, fleeing a ghost that didn't exist. Elias stood on the cliff edge, his hand still on the volume knob. He was shaking. Adrenaline flooded his system, masking the pain in his ears. He watched the dust settle. The valley was quiet again, save for the idling excavators left behind. "We did it," Elias whispered. He fell to his knees, exhausted. "We actually did it." Barnaby licked the sweat off Elias's face. Poe circled back, landing on the speaker, looking down at the empty valley with a smug tilt of his head. But then, something happened that Elias didn't expect. The silence didn't return. The phantom track had stopped. The trucks were gone. But a sound remained. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from the woods behind them. Elias froze. He spun around. "Barnaby, stay." It was a slow, rhythmic impact. Like footsteps. Heavy ones. Poe stopped preening. He looked into the dense tree line. His feathers flattened. He didn't mimic this sound. He listened to it. Out of the shadows of the Douglas firs, a figure emerged. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a logger. It was Ranger Miller. He was wearing his uniform, his hand resting cautiously on his belt, not on a gun, but on his radio. He looked at the speakers. He looked at the recorder. He looked at the old man kneeling in the dirt with a giant dog and a raven. The ranger's face was pale. He had heard the sounds. He had felt the ground shake. "Elias?" Miller asked, his voice trembling slightly. "What in God's name was that?" Elias scrambled to turn off the amplifiers. I can explain. The noise. They were too loud. I just wanted them to stop." Miller looked down at the valley, where the million-dollar operation had just fled in terror. Then he looked back at Elias. "You realized you just scared off a federal contract crew with—" Miller squinted at the equipment. "A tape recorder." Elias hung his head. "I'm sorry. I'll pack up. I'll turn myself in." Miller stood there for a long moment. The wind whistled through the trees. Then a strange expression crossed the ranger's face. He let out a breath he had been holding. "Turn yourself in." Miller stepped closer. He looked at the bird. "Elias, do you have any idea what you just did?" Elias braced himself for the handcuffs. "There's been a poaching ring operating in this valley for 6 months," Miller said quietly. "My team couldn't catch them. They have lookouts. They disappear every time we get close." Miller pointed to the abandoned excavators. "Those aren't Forest Service machines. That's not a legal logging crew. That's a clear-cut operation using fake decals. I've been trying to get probable cause to raid them for weeks." Elias blinked. They were illegal." "They were," Miller smiled, a genuine, bewildered grin. "And you just spooked them so bad they left their evidence behind. You didn't just stop the noise, Elias. You saved the ridge." Poe hopped onto Elias's shoulder. He looked at Ranger Miller. And then, strictly for his own amusement, Poe mimicked the sound of a police siren. Well. Miller laughed. It was a loud, hearty laugh. Elias flinched at the volume, but for the first time in years, the sound of laughter didn't feel like an attack. It felt like relief. "You've got a hell of a partner there, Elias," Miller said. "But we have a problem." "What?" Elias asked. "You can't stay in the tower anymore. Not after this. When they realize it was a trick, they might come back. And they won't be scared next time." The victory evaporated. The cold reality washed over Elias. He had won the battle, but he had exposed his position. "Where do I go?" Elias whispered. "I can't go to town. The noise." Miller looked at the bird, then at the old man. "I know a place," Miller said. "It's an old fire watch station. Abandoned. Even deeper in the woods. High altitude. Silent. But it needs a keeper. Someone who listens." Elias looked at Poe. The bird bobbed his head. "We're listening," Elias said.